The 1950s were a time of innovation, scientific progress, and cultural changes. In this video, we will break down the important events bit by bit. First off, we will talk about the Eisenhower years. President Eisenhower won the election in a landslide after the presidency of Truman. He abolished the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which loaned money to banks, railroads, and other large institutions in financial trouble. He was also dealing with intense Cold War tensions and helped strengthen NATO. He also targeted aid to businesses, or what he called creeping socialism. He cut funding to the TVA. No, not that TVA. This one. He took an activist role in the field of better transportation, which the three previous administrations had failed to accomplish. He also agreed to extend the Social Security system to an additional 10 million people and extend unemployment benefits to 4 million more citizens. He even agreed to raise the minimum wage and to continue to provide some government aid to farmers. When he ran for his second term in 1956, the nation had successfully shifted back to a peacetime economy. What policies of Eisenhower do we still see implemented today? The tension between the US and the Soviet Union, known as the Cold War, was another defining element of the 1950s. After World War II, Western leaders began to worry that the USSR threatened democracy by bringing along communism. An idea emerged and shaped American policy for decades that communism needed to be stopped by diplomacy, threats, or force. Many people in the US worried that communists could destroy American society from the inside as well as the outside. Between 1945 and 1952, Congress held 84 hearings designed to put an end to un-American activities in the federal government, in universities and public schools, and even in Hollywood. These hearings did not uncover many treacherous activities or even many communists, but tens of thousands of Americans lost their jobs as well as their families and friends in the anti-communist Red Scare of the 1950s.
Okay, boomer, whatever you say, boomer.
The US birth rate escalated after World War II. From 1946 to 1964, more than
a relatively small amount, 68 million
children were born in the United States. Many factors contributed to this baby boom. Young couples who had put off getting married during World War II and the Korean War could finally begin their families, and popular culture celebrated pregnancy, parenthood, and large families. Next, we're going to discuss the workplace changes. As the economy grew, more Americans began working in offices in what came to be called white-collar jobs, since the employees typically wore a white dress shirt and a tie to work. Workers in factories wore blue denim work shirts and were known as the blue-collar jobs. The shift to white-collar jobs was partly the result of both new technology and management innovations introduced into the workplace. In the 1950s, the first business computers came onto the market. As companies began to use computers, managers were able to consolidate clerical tasks across departments. Fewer clerical workers were needed as their tasks could be done by machines. To be more competitive, some corporations expanded overseas and became multinational corporations. The idea of franchises also became more popular. Their new business methods created more economic opportunities for citizens. What are some examples of modern-day franchises you can think of? Now we will discuss the advances made in the fields of science. The electronics industry advanced when 3 US physicists developed the transistor, a tiny electric generator that made it possible to create small portable radios. Scientists also developed one of the nation's earliest computers, the electronic numerical integrator and computer, which was used to make military calculations. Aircraft designers made changes in aviation by using more plastics and light metals to build planes that could fly farther on the same amount of fuel. All of these advances made airline travel affordable for more people. Then we're going to discuss the field of television and movies. Regular television broadcasts had begun in the early 1940s, but there were few stations and sets were expensive. Early television programs included comedies and action programs. As television's popularity grew, movies lost viewers. Attendance for movies plunged from 82 million in 1946 to 36 million by 1950. By 1960, 1/5 of the nation's movie theaters had closed. After several failed attempts to get people to come back to the movies, theaters finally developed CinemaScope, which is a process that showed movies on large panoramic screens. This finally gave Hollywood something that television could not match. Hollywood had a new approach to movie making with big investments. They were getting so popular that even Europeans were won over. Hollywood began diffusing American culture across the globe, a role that continues to the present day. Do you prefer watching films on the big screen or watching on the comfort of your own home? This is a debate that continues to go on to this day. After that, we have advances in music. As a result of the expansion of radios, the number of radio stations more than doubled between 1948 and 1957. Rock and roll was a new form of music that was gaining popularity. Rock and roll became widely popular due to its loud and heavy beat, which was found appealing for dancing. However, many adults condemned rock and roll as loud, mindless, and dangerous. Some places banned rock and roll from the jukeboxes. The rock and roll hits that teens bought in record numbers united them in a world their parents did not share, which led to the generation gap, or the cultural separation between children and their parents. A group of mostly white writers and artists who called themselves beats or beatniks highlighted a values gap in 1950s America. Beat poets, writers, and artists criticized American culture for its sterility, conformity, and emptiness. African American entertainers struggled to find acceptance, as, with a few notable exceptions, television tended to shut out African Americans. However, African American rock and roll singers faced fewer obstacles. The use of these early rock and roll artists profoundly influenced popular music around the world. Do you like rock and roll music, or is it too outdated for your standards? Now let's talk about African Americans during the 1950s. A growing group of African Americans were speaking out against inequality and injustice during this time. During the 1950s, however, the struggle against racism and segregation entered the mainstream of American life. For example, in 1954, in the landmark Brown versus Board of Education case, the Supreme Court decided that separate educational facilities. In December 1955, a black woman named Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give her seat up on a city bus to a white woman. Her arrest started a 13-month boycott of the city's buses by its black citizens, which only ended when the bus companies stopped discriminating against African American passengers. Acts of nonviolent resistance like the boycott helped shape the civil rights movement of the next decade. What are some prominent pro-civil rights protests you might see today? Next, we're going to talk about the growth of the suburbs. Between 1947 and 1951, families were rushing to buy inexpensive homes in the suburbs. Some people wished to escape the crime and congestion of the city and believed that suburbs afforded a better life and were more affordable. This led to the suburban population doubling, while the population of cities rose by only 10%. Do you plan on living in the suburbs when you grow up, or are you more of a city person? In conclusion, the 1950s were an important time and many cultural and scientific changes were experienced. Thank you very much for watching our video, and hopefully you found it informative.